You were cold. Not the kind of cold that a blanket fixes. The kind that has been settling into your bones since before you woke. The kind that has no clear beginning, that was there when you were asleep and is still there now. In your shoulders, in your hips, in the places where your body pressed against the ground through the night. The ground is not a mattress. It is not even a pile of leaves, though there are leaves, and dry grass, and the skins of animals that were killed months ago and scraped and stretched and softened by hands that knew how to do this because they had been taught and because they had no other choice. You have been sleeping on this surface your entire life. Your body has adapted to it in ways that a body sleeping on a mattress has not. But it is still cold. It is always cold in the hour before dawn. The year is approximately 50,000 before the Common Era, or 70,000, or 30,000. The precise number does not matter much, because the day you are about to live would be recognizable across almost the entire span of human prehistory, across the vast majority of the time that beings like you have existed on this planet. You are anatomically modern. Your brain is the same size as a brain living today, in a city, with a phone and a coffee machine and a calendar full of meetings. Your capacity for language, for abstract thought, for planning and memory and emotion and creativity is fully developed. What is different is everything outside the skull. The world you have woken into is not the world of cities and agriculture and writing and money and borders. It is older than all of those things by orders of magnitude. It is the world that made you. It is, in a very real sense, the world you were built for. You are listening to Histomnia. If this kind of story helps you rest, consider subscribing. It truly helps the channel grow. And let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? We love knowing who is with us in the quiet hours. And if there is a topic you would like to hear next, leave it below. You are somewhere in what will eventually be called Europe, though that name will not exist for another 5,000 years or so, and the continent you are on looks nothing like it will look when that name is finally given to it. The ice sheets that cover the northern third of the continent have not yet retreated. The sea levels are lower than they will be when the ice melts, which means there is land where there will later be water, a broad plain connecting what will become Britain to what will become France, a land bridge where mammoths walk. The landscape you can see from the entrance of your shelter, if you were to stand there now and look out, would be unrecognizable to any modern eye. Open grassland, mostly, stands of birch and pine in the lower valleys where the wind is less savage. A river somewhere to the south, audible on still mornings if you know how to listen. And animals, everywhere, animals, more kinds of large animal than will exist anywhere on Earth after humans have spent a few thousand years with agriculture and metal tools and the particular efficiency that comes from being very smart and very hungry. There are perhaps 30 people in your group, maybe 25, maybe 35. The number fluctuates because this is what numbers do in a world without hospitals or antibiotics or reliable food storage. Children are born and sometimes survive and sometimes do not. Old people, and old here means perhaps 40, perhaps 45. The rare individual who has navigated 5 decades of this existence intact are respected and listened to because they carry knowledge that cannot be written down and therefore cannot be recovered if it is lost. You know everyone in your group. You know them the way human beings are designed to know people, which is deeply and completely and with the full complexity of years of shared experience, their habits, their fears, their skills, their moods, the specific way each of them moves when they are tired or hungry or frightened. You have never met a stranger and formed a relationship with them over the internet. You have never been alone in a crowd. The concept of loneliness, as modern people understand it, does not exist in your vocabulary because the condition it describes does not exist in your life. You are embedded in your group the way a word is embedded in a sentence. You have meaning in context, and outside of context, you do not survive. The shelter you woke in is not a cave, though your people know the caves in this region and use them sometimes, in the worst of the winter cold, when the wind makes open air sleeping impossible. Tonight it was a low structure of branches and bark, partly dug into a hillside for insulation, covered with hides that keep the wind out, but admit the cold in the slow, inevitable way that cold always finds its way in. 6 people slept in this space, bodies pressed together for warmth, breathing the same air, sharing the same heat that living bodies generate simply by being alive. This closeness is not uncomfortable to you. It is the only way you have ever slept. The idea of sleeping alone in a room would be, if you could somehow conceive of it, not luxurious, but frightening. Alone means vulnerable. Alone means unprotected. Alone in the world you inhabit means something that the nervous system processes as threat, not comfort. The fire is low. Someone banked it before sleeping, covered the coals with ash to slow the burn, to preserve what took real effort to create. You do not make fire from scratch every time you want it. You carry it. Fire is a possession, a resource, something that must be tended and maintained the way a modern person tends and maintains their phone, with constant low-level attention, with the awareness that losing it would be a serious problem. The man who tends the fire in your group, this is his primary skill. The thing he is known for, the thing that gives him status, can make fire from scratch if he must, using a bow drill and tinder that he has prepared and stored carefully, dry fungus and fine shavings of wood wrapped in a bundle of dry grass. But making fire from scratch takes time and effort and conditions that are not always available. And so the preferred strategy is never to let it go out. The fire has not gone out in 11 days. This is a point of quiet pride. You become aware, in the half-light of early morning, of the sounds outside the shelter. Birds, specifically. The particular calls of specific birds whose presence or absence tells you things about the morning, whether a predator passed recently, whether the weather will hold, whether the direction of the wind has shifted. You cannot articulate this knowledge as a list of rules. It is not that kind of knowledge. It is the knowledge that lives in the body. The knowledge that has been absorbed over years of paying attention to a single landscape until the landscape has become, in a sense, an extension of the self. You know this hillside, you know this valley, you know this stretch of forest and this river bend, and the particular way the light falls on the eastern slope in late afternoon. This knowledge, accumulated over a lifetime of presence in one place, is one of the most sophisticated cognitive achievements in the history of life on Earth. It just does not look like intelligence to modern eyes, because modern eyes are trained to recognize a different kind of intelligence entirely. Someone stirs beside you, the older woman who is, depending on how you count these things, either your aunt or your grandmother. The distinction is less clear in your kinship system than it would be in a modern family tree. She is awake before anyone else, as she usually is, and she is already thinking, which you can tell from the particular quality of her stillness. She has been awake for perhaps an hour, lying in the dark, listening and thinking, doing the cognitive work of the day before the day begins, planning in the way that people plan when their planning is not done on paper or in a calendar but in the mind, through memory and pattern recognition and the slow accumulation of probabilities. Where to look for plant food today, what the weather is likely to do, whether the men should go north or east for the hunt, and why. Her knowledge of this landscape is the deepest in the group, because she has lived in it the longest, and because she has been paying attention for 50 years to a world that rewards attention and punishes inattention with a directness that modern life rarely matches. You sit up. The cold settles around your shoulders like a weight. Outside, the darkness is thinning. The faintest grey at the eastern edge of the sky, the stars beginning to fade, the world resolving itself slowly from darkness into shape. The day is about to begin, and the day in this world is not something that happens to you. It is something you move through with your full attention, your full body, your full intelligence applied to the problem of staying alive in a landscape that is beautiful and abundant and completely indifferent to whether you make it through to the next dawn. Close your eyes if you like. Let the sounds of the world around you grow quiet. Tonight, we are going to spend one full day in the life of a human being who lived before everything that we think of as civilization, before agriculture, before cities, before writing, before money, before borders, before the entire accumulated apparatus of the modern world. We will follow the day from this cold grey dawn, through the hunt and the gathering, and the making of tools, and the tending of fire, and the sharing of food, into the long evening around the fire, when stories are told, and the first art is made, and the darkness beyond the firelight is held at bay by the oldest human technology of all, which is the sound of a human voice telling a story in the dark. We will look at what the science of archaeology and anthropology and evolutionary biology and cognitive psychology has to tell us about how these people actually lived. Not the sanitized version, not the brutal version, but the real version, which is more interesting and more human and more recognizable than either. And we will ask the question that this kind of history always eventually asks. What did they have that we have lost? And what have we gained that they could not have imagined? And what does it tell us about what human beings actually are? Underneath everything that history has added to us, the fire is still burning. The dawn is coming. Let us begin. The first thing you do in the morning, before you eat, before you drink, before you speak to anyone, is listen. This is not a habit you developed consciously. It is something that happens automatically. The way breathing happens automatically. The way your eyes adjust to light automatically. You wake and your ears are already working, already sorting the sounds of the morning into categories. Safe, neutral, worth attention, before your conscious mind has fully arrived in the day. The birds again, the wind in the grass, a distant splash from the direction of the river, which could be a fish or could be something larger. The particular silence that falls sometimes in the early morning, the absence of small sounds, which is more alarming than any noise, because small animals go quiet when something large is moving. This morning the small sounds are present and normal. Nothing large has passed recently. You relax, not completely, never completely, but enough, and begin the process of preparing for the day. The men of your group have been discussing the hunt for 3 days, not in the way that modern people discuss things, not in a meeting, not with an agenda, not with one person speaking while others listen. The discussion happens in fragments, over meals and around the fire, and during the quiet moments of the day when 2 or 3 people find themselves together with nothing urgent to do. A comment about tracks seen 2 days ago to the north. A response about the direction of the wind, which matters because the animals you are hunting have a sense of smell that is, by any reasonable measure, supernatural. They can detect a human being from distances that would require binoculars to see across. Another comment about the place where 3 aurochs were seen last week. grazing in the shallow valley where the grass grows longest. These fragments accumulate into a plan without anyone formally proposing one. By this morning, without anything being decided in any explicit way, everyone knows what is going to happen. The men are going north. There are 5 of them going today. You are one of them. The oldest is perhaps 38, a lean man with a damaged left hand, 2 fingers lost to an accident with a flint tool years ago, who moves through the landscape with a stillness and an economy of motion that you have been studying and trying to imitate since you were old enough to notice the difference between how he moves and how everyone else moves. He does not waste energy. He does not make unnecessary sounds. He reads the landscape the way a scholar reads a text, and when he stops and looks at something, a bent stem of grass, a disturbance in the soil, a single feather caught in a thorn bush, the others stop and look too, because his attention is never wasted, and his stillness always means something. The weapons you carry are the product of hours of careful work spread over many days. The spears are wooden shafts, straightened by heating and bending, tipped with points of flint that were napped to shape by the same man with the damaged hand, who is the best tool maker in the group and who produces points of a precision and sharpness that the others can appreciate but not replicate. The flint itself was carried from a source 2 days' walk to the east, because the local stone is wrong, too coarse. It does not fracture cleanly, and the good flint must be sought and carried and treated with the care that any valuable and irreplaceable material demands. Some of the points are wrapped carefully in leather when not in use, not because they are precious in a sentimental sense, but because a broken point means hours of rework, and hours are not an infinitely available resource when there are other things that also need doing. You also carry, in a pouch at your belt, a fire kit, not because you expect to need fire during the hunt, but because the landscape you are moving into is large and unfamiliar at its edges, and because not carrying a fire kit is the kind of decision that seems reasonable until it is not. The fire kit contains a piece of iron pyrite, a piece of flint, and a small bundle of dried fungus and fine shavings wrapped in dry grass. Making fire with these materials takes practice and patience and the right conditions. Dry air, dry tinder, the particular angle and force of strike that produces a spark that lands in exactly the right place. You have done it successfully, perhaps 40 times in your life. You have failed perhaps 100. The group leaves the camp in the grey light before full dawn. No goodbyes, no ceremony. The women and children and older people who are staying behind watch you go with the particular quality of attention that people give to departures they have seen many times and that they know may be the last time. This is not a thought that anyone dwells on. Dwelling on it would not help, but it is present in the quality of the looks, in the way the older woman, your aunt, your grandmother, hold your gaze for a moment before looking away. The movement through the landscape is nothing like a modern walk. You do not follow a path, because there are no paths here in the human-made sense. There are animal trails, worn into the grass by generations of hooves, and these are useful as guides to where the animals are likely to be. But following them directly would mean arriving at your destination, trailing a cloud of human scent that would clear the area of prey before you got within throwing distance. Instead, you move in a long arc, using the wind, which is coming from the northwest this morning, which is useful to keep your scent away from the area you are approaching. This requires constant adjustment as the wind shifts, as the terrain channels it in unexpected directions, as the morning warms and the air begins to move differently than it did in the cold grey dawn. You move in single file, spaced apart, each person watching their own sector of the landscape. There is very little talking, not because talking is forbidden. There is no rule here. No one would enforce such a rule if there were, but because talking makes noise, and noise is information given to anything nearby that has ears, and in this landscape, nearly everything that matters has excellent ears. Communication happens through gesture when it needs to happen. A raised hand means stop. A slow lowering of the body means crouch and be still. A tilt of the head in a specific direction means look there. These signals are not a formal language. They were not invented. They were not taught in any explicit lesson. They emerged from necessity and shared experience, and they work because everyone in the group has been using them since childhood and understands them as fluently as spoken words. An hour into the walk, the man with the damaged hand stops. Everyone stops. He crouches slowly, without any sudden movement, and looks at something on the ground. You move forward carefully and look at what he is looking at. A print in the soft earth at the edge of a dried stream bed. Aurochs, a large one, judging by the size and depth of the impression. The print is perhaps 2 hours old. The man with the damaged hand reads this not from any single detail, but from the combination of a dozen things. The moisture content of the disturbed soil, the degree to which the edges of the print have crumbled, the insects that have moved back into the area after the disturbance, the way the grass around the print has begun, very slightly, to spring back from being pressed down. He does not think through this analysis consciously, the way a detective thinks through clues. He simply knows, the way you know which direction is north without calculating it, and his knowledge is reliable in the way that knowledge built from 50,000 generations of survival pressure is reliable. He looks north. He looks at the others. He begins moving again, and the group follows. The aurochs, when you find them, are 3. A large bull and 2 younger animals, grazing in a shallow bowl in the landscape where a spring makes the grass greener and longer than the surrounding plain. You see them from the crest of a low rise, lying flat in the grass, heads down, barely breathing. The wind is still good, from the northwest, carrying your scent away to the south, where there is nothing to smell it. The animals are perhaps 80 meters away. 80 meters is too far for a reliable throw. 60 meters would be better. 50 would be better still. What follows is a wait that lasts, by any modern measure of time, an extraordinarily long time. Perhaps 40 minutes, perhaps an hour. No one moves, no one speaks. The grass presses against your face and chest, and the ground is cold and damp through your clothing, and an insect of some kind is walking across your forearm with a deliberateness that is almost meditative. You wait. This is not the anxious, fidgeting waiting of a modern person waiting for something, the checking of the phone that isn't there, the restless shifting of weight. It is a different quality of waiting, closer to the stillness of a sleeping animal, the body conserving energy while the mind remains lightly, continuously alert. You could wait like this for 2 hours. You have waited like this for longer. The younger of the two smaller animals drifts, grazing, toward the edge of the bowl. It is now perhaps 65 meters away and moving in a direction that will, if it continues, bring it to 60, maybe 55. The man with the damaged hand is already moving, so slowly that the grass seems to part of its own accord. His body somehow lower and more still in motion than most people are at rest. You begin to move too, angling to flank from the right, as you have done before, in situations that were different in detail, but identical in structure. What happens in the next 30 seconds has been rehearsed 10,000 times by your body, in practice and in memory, and in the dreams that sometimes replay the best and worst hunts of your life. The throw, when it comes, is not thought about, it simply happens. The accumulated knowledge of years expressing itself through your arm and shoulder, and the particular release of a spear that has been balanced and weighted and practiced with until the throwing of it feels like an extension of intention rather than a physical act. The animal goes down. There is no celebration. There is a moment, brief, wordless, of something that is not quite relief and not quite satisfaction, but is the specific feeling of a thing having gone as it was supposed to go. The alignment of plan and execution and outcome that produces a quiet, deep rightness. And then there is work. The work of an animal that weighs perhaps 300 kilograms and needs to be processed where it fell. Because you cannot carry 300 kilograms back to camp, and because the smell of blood in an open landscape is an advertisement that other things will respond to, and the window for this work is not long. The butchering is efficient and practiced, and produces, within an hour, packages of meat and organs and hide that can be carried. Nothing is wasted. everything that can be used is used, or set aside to be used. The hide for clothing and shelter, the bones for tools and fuel, the sinew for binding and cord, the fat for waterproofing and fire starting, and a dozen other purposes that will become clear over the weeks that follow. The liver is eaten on the spot, raw, because it is the most nutritious thing available, and because nutrition is not an abstract concept in your world, but a felt physical reality. The body knowing what it needs and taking it when it is available, because availability is not guaranteed, and the body has learned across a very long time not to be precious about such things. The walk back to camp is slower than the walk out, weighted with what you are carrying, but it is a different kind of slow. The morning has gone well. The group will eat tonight. This is, in the world you inhabit, the definition of a good day. While the men were gone, the camp did not wait. This is one of the things that the popular image of prehistoric life gets most consistently wrong. The idea that hunting was the work and everything else was waiting for the hunting to be done. The hunting was important. The hunting produced the large concentrations of protein and fat that made the difference between a group that was healthy and a group that was not. But hunting was also unreliable, dangerous, and dependent on conditions that could not be controlled. On any given day, the hunters might come back empty-handed. On any given week, the weather or the movement of the animals or simple bad luck might mean no successful hunt at all. The plant food was different. The plant food was always there, or almost always, and knowing where it was and when it was ready, and how to prepare it, and how much of it was safe to eat, was knowledge that kept the group alive on the days when the hunt failed, and supplemented the hunt on the days when it succeeded. The woman who leads the gathering party today is perhaps 30 years old, which makes her one of the more experienced adults in the group. She has 3 children, the youngest carried on her back in a wrap of softened hide, the older 2 walking beside her with the particular focused attention of children who have been doing this long enough to understand that it is not play. The gathering is not play. It is work, serious work, and children learn it by doing it alongside adults who correct mistakes and explain choices and point out the things that are not obvious to an untrained eye. This morning they are heading east, toward the edge of the woodland, where the forest meets the open grassland, and the variety of plants is greatest. The transition zones, the places where 2 different environments overlap, are among the most productive landscapes for gatherers, because they contain species from both environments, and the light conditions at the forest edge encourage dense growth of exactly the kinds of plants that produce edible roots and seeds and fruits. Your people have known this about the landscape for as long as anyone can remember, which means for longer than memory goes, which means it is simply part of how the world is understood. The older woman from the shelter, your aunt, your grandmother, is with the gathering party today. She is too old for the long walks of the hunt, and her joints make the cold mornings difficult in ways she does not complain about, but that are visible in how she moves for the first hour of the day, before the warmth gets into her. But her knowledge of plants is deeper than anyone else in the group, accumulated over 5 decades of paying attention to a landscape that she has never left. And the gathering party is always better when she is with it. She walks slowly, which means the party walks slowly. But slowness in gathering is often useful. You see more when you are not moving quickly, and the things you see slowly are sometimes the things you would have walked past. The landscape between the camp and the woodland edge is not empty. It is full, if you know how to look at it. The grass itself is edible, or rather the seeds of certain grasses are edible, not all of them. And knowing which ones requires knowledge that was tested over generations by people who sometimes got it wrong and suffered the consequences and passed on what they learned. Some of the grasses that look most like wheat, most obviously food-like to a modern eye, are in fact mildly toxic. Others that look unremarkable produce seeds that are nutritious and abundant and easy to process, the knowledge of which lives in the older woman's memory with a precision and completeness that a modern botanist would find impressive if they could somehow access it. There are tubers, several kinds, each with its own season and its own location and its own preparation requirements. One of them, a starchy root that grows in the damp ground near seasonal pools, requires roasting to be digestible. Eating it raw produces stomach cramps that are severe enough to be incapacitating, a fact that was presumably discovered at some cost and has been carefully transmitted ever since. Another, a smaller root with a bitter taste that most people find unpleasant, becomes palatable and nutritious when dried and ground to a paste with water. The grinding stones for this purpose are among the heaviest objects the group carries when they move camp, heavy enough that their presence in an archaeological site tens of thousands of years later tells researchers something important about how much these foods were valued. The children collect things and bring them to the older woman for judgment. A berry, deep purple, growing in a cluster at the base of a thorn bush. She takes it, examines it, smells it, and gives it back with a small gesture that means yes. A mushroom, pale and frilled, growing from a patch of disturbed soil. She takes this one too, turns it over, looks at the gills, and puts it in her own bag with a small nod. A different mushroom, superficially similar, but with a slightly different cap shape, growing nearby. She takes this one, looks at it, and drops it deliberately on the ground, a clear gesture that means no, without explanation, because the explanation is in the mushroom itself, and the knowledge required to read it is not something you can convey with words alone. The child watches where it falls and does not pick it up again. This transmission of knowledge from older to younger through direct observation and guided practice rather than through language or text is one of the most important things happening in the gathering party today. Though it is happening so naturally and continuously that it would be invisible to an outside observer. The older woman is not teaching in any formal sense. She is not explaining principles or setting tasks or correcting errors with any particular ceremony. She is simply doing what she knows how to do, in the presence of people who need to learn it, and the learning happens as a byproduct of the doing. This is how almost everything important is learned in your world. There are no schools. There are no books. There are no lectures. There is only the continuous experience of doing things alongside people who know how. In a world that provides immediate and unambiguous feedback on whether you have understood correctly, the party stops at a stand of hazelnuts at the edge of the woodland. The nuts are not yet fully ripe. They are still encased in their green husks. The shells inside them not yet hardened to their full density. But they are close, and the older woman knows this grove and knows its timing, and she has been watching it for weeks, counting the days since the flowering, assessing the weight of the nuts against her memory of previous years. She strips a few from a branch, opens one, examines the nut inside. She takes a small bite, chews slowly, thinks. Then she begins filling her bag. The others follow. The children strip the lower branches with an efficiency that speaks to many previous seasons of this same work at this same grove, their small hands moving quickly through the leaves, the nuts falling into their bags with a soft, continuous sound that is one of the better sounds of the autumn. The sound of stored energy, of calories that will matter in the lean weeks of late winter when the hunting is poor and the early spring plants have not yet emerged. The group carries bags woven from plant fiber, sized to carry perhaps 10 or 12 kilograms each, and by the time the grove is exhausted, these bags are nearly full, and there is a discussion, conducted in a few words and several gestures, about whether to cache some of the load nearby and return for it later, or carry everything now. They carry everything now. The return journey is heavy and slow. The youngest child, tired and full of hazelnuts eaten on the way, is carried on its mother's back alongside the bag of gathered food, which makes the load considerable. No one complains. Complaining about the weight of food on the way back to camp is not a thing that happens in your world, because the weight of food is the point, and the alternative to the weight is the lightness of empty hands, which is much worse. There are dangers in the woodland that are not in the open grassland, and that require a different quality of attention. The cats are the main concern, not lions, though lions exist in this landscape, but the smaller cats, the ones that hunt in the low light of dawn and dusk, and that are capable of taking a child or a weakened adult with a speed and silence that leaves no time for response. The gathering party moves through the woodland edge with this in mind, never spreading too far apart, the older children keeping close without being told to, everyone's eyes doing the work that their ears did in the open grassland, scanning the shadows between the trees for the particular stillness that means something is watching. Nothing is watching today, or nothing that acts on it. The party emerges from the woodland edge into the open grassland in the early afternoon, heavy with food, and begins the walk back toward camp. The sky has clouded since morning, grey and low, with the smell of rain in it, the particular smell that triggers a specific response in your body, a quickening, a desire to be under cover, because rain in this landscape is not an inconvenience, but a variable that changes everything about the calculation of comfort and safety and fire. They arrive at camp shortly before the men return with the meat. The camp that evening is, by any reasonable measure, a good one. There is food. There is fire. The rain holds off until after dark, when the shelters are in place and the fire is protected and the group is gathered under cover, warm and fed and together. This is the best that the day can be. This is, in the vocabulary of your world, abundance, not the abundance of surplus and storage that agriculture will eventually make possible, but the abundance of enough to eat, enough warmth, enough safety for now. The group intact and together at the end of a day that could have gone differently and did not. The fire burns low. The rain begins on the heights above. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, something moves through the wet grass and then is still. Fire is the oldest thing in your world that you did not inherit from the world itself. The river was here before you. The grass was here before you. The animals and the trees and the stone and the sky were all here before any human being arrived to notice them. But fire, the controlled, tended, deliberately maintained fire that burns at the center of your camp, that is yours. Not yours personally, not yours as a group in any legal or territorial sense, but yours as a species, the thing that separates what you are from what everything else is. Every other animal in this landscape either avoids fire or is indifferent to it. You are the only creature that carries it with you, feeds it, protects it, moves it from place to place, and organizes your entire daily existence around its presence. The question of when human beings first controlled fire is one that archaeologists have been arguing about for decades, and the honest answer is that we do not know precisely. The oldest clear evidence, hearths, burned bones, heat, altered sediments in contexts that could only have been produced by deliberate fire use, dates to roughly 400,000 years ago at sites in Israel and Kenya and possibly South Africa. Some researchers believe the practice is older, perhaps 1 million years or more, pointing to evidence that is suggestive but not conclusive. What is clear is that by the time of the people you are living among, 50,000 years ago, 70,000, the exact number mattering less than the scale of it, fire has been part of human life for so long that it is not experienced as a technology at all. It is experienced as a necessity of existence, as fundamental as breathing, as natural as sleeping. The world without fire is not a world anyone in your group has ever known or can clearly imagine. What fire does is not just warmth and light. Though warmth and light are not nothing, warmth extends the range of environments where humans can survive, and light extends the hours of the day available for the activities that require visibility, which is most of them. What fire does beyond warmth and light is cooking, and cooking is one of the most transformative technologies in the history of life on Earth, though the people using it have no framework for understanding it in those terms. They know that cooked food tastes better. They know that some foods that are inedible or harmful raw become edible when heated. They know that meat keeps longer if it has been cooked, and that roots and tubers that are starchy and tough and difficult to chew when raw become soft and digestible when they have been buried in hot coals for a few hours. What they do not know, because this knowledge requires biochemistry that will not be developed for another 50,000 years, is that cooking fundamentally changes the energetic value of food, that it breaks down cell walls and denatures proteins and gelatinizes starches in ways that make calories more accessible to the human digestive system, effectively allowing the body to extract more energy from the same quantity of food. The anthropologist Richard Wrangham at Harvard University has argued that cooking is not just an improvement on raw food, but the foundation of human anatomy itself. That the reduction in gut size, the increase in brain size, and the changes in tooth and jaw structure that distinguish modern humans from earlier hominins were all driven over hundreds of thousands of years by the shift to a cooked diet. A larger gut is required to extract nutrition from raw food. A smaller gut is sufficient when food is cooked. The energy freed up by reducing the gut went, Wrangham argues, into the brain, which is an extraordinarily expensive organ in metabolic terms. The human brain, which is roughly 2% of body weight, consumes roughly 20% of the body's caloric intake. Growing a bigger brain required a reliable source of extra calories. Cooking provided it. In this reading of human evolution, the person tending the fire tonight is not just keeping warm. They are maintaining the technology that made the brain that is doing the tending. The man who tends your group's fire is named in whatever sounds pass for names in your language, something that approximates to the idea of steadiness, a name that was given to him because of a quality he demonstrated early, the particular calm and reliability that firekeeping requires. He is perhaps 28 years old, slightly built, with none of the physical presence that makes the hunter with the damaged hand immediately noticeable. He is not the most impressive person in the group to look at, but the quality of attention he brings to the fire and the knowledge that underlies that attention is a form of intelligence as sophisticated and as demanding as any other kind of intelligence in your world. He knows fire the way a musician knows an instrument, not as a set of rules, but as a living relationship, full of nuance and judgment, and the accumulated learning of years of close observation. He knows how different woods burn differently, and why, and which ones produce the steady, long-burning coals that are best for cooking meat, and which ones produce the hot, bright flames that are best for warmth, and which ones produce the dense, aromatic smoke that can be used to preserve food or signal across a distance or discourage certain insects. He knows how the fire behaves in different weather, how wind affects it, how moisture affects it, how cold affects it, and how to compensate for each. He knows the difference between a fire that is about to go out and a fire that merely looks like it is about to go out. And he knows this difference not from any explicit theory, but from thousands of hours of watching and responding. The materials he uses are not random. The tinder, the fine, easily ignitable material that catches the first spark, is prepared in advance, dried carefully, stored in a container that keeps it dry regardless of the weather. The container is a length of hollow bone, sealed at both ends with a plug of dried clay, small enough to fit in a belt pouch. Inside it is a mixture of dried fungus, specifically a bracket fungus that grows on birch trees and that catches sparks with a reliability that other materials do not match, and the finest possible wood shavings, produced with a flint scraper and dried until they are almost weightless. This combination, when a spark from iron pyrite strikes it, will hold an ember for long enough to transfer it to a larger bundle of dry grass and blow it carefully into a flame. The larger fuel is equally considered. For a cooking fire, dense hardwood is best. Oak if it is available, hazel otherwise. The wood splits to expose the interior, which burns more consistently than the bark-covered surface. For a fire that needs to last through the night with minimal tending, the same dense wood is banked with ash to slow the combustion, the coals buried under an insulating layer that preserves the heat while reducing the oxygen supply, so that the fire smolders rather than burns and can be revived in the morning by simply uncovering the coals and adding tinder and small fuel. Tonight, with the rain falling and the group settled under the hides, the fire is maintained at a middle level, warm enough to be useful, not so large that it consumes fuel unnecessarily. Fuel is not infinite. The immediate area around any long-term camp gradually becomes depleted of easily gathered wood, which is one of the reasons that your group moves periodically, following the patterns of game and plant food, but also simply allowing the landscape around a camp to recover before returning to it. The man who tends the fire knows the fuel situation at any given camp better than anyone else, because he is the one who uses it, and his sense of how many days remain before the quality of the available wood declines to the point where moving becomes necessary is one of the inputs that goes into the group's decisions about when and where to travel. The fire does one more thing that none of the people sitting around it could articulate, but that all of them feel. It makes a boundary. On the inside of the firelight, there is warmth and visibility and the faces of the people you know. On the outside is darkness, and in the darkness are the things that the darkness contains, the predators that hunt at night, the unknown, the formless fear that is the oldest fear in the mammalian nervous system. The fear of being eaten in the dark that has been shaping the behavior of small warm-blooded creatures for 200 million years. The fire does not eliminate what is in the darkness. It defines a space that is not the darkness, a circle of safety and light in which human beings can gather and eat and talk and sleep without the constant background processing of mortal fear consuming all available attention. This is why fire is social in a way that no other technology is social. You cannot eat fire. You cannot wear fire. You cannot use fire to hunt or gather or make tools. But you can sit around fire with other people, and the sitting around fire with other people is in itself one of the most important things that human beings do. The anthropologist Polly Wiesner, who spent decades studying the Juhoansi people of southern Africa and recorded what they talked about around nighttime fires, found a striking pattern. During the day, conversation was mostly about practical matters: food, resources, complaints, social tensions, the logistics of daily life. Around the fire at night, the conversation changed entirely. People told stories. They discussed distant places and people who were not present. They speculated about things that could not be directly observed. They laughed. They sang. They performed the social maintenance work of a species whose survival depends on cooperation, and whose cooperation depends on shared understanding and mutual trust that must be continuously renewed. The fire, in other words, is not just the technology that cooked the food that built the brain. It is the technology that created the context in which the brain was used for the things that make us most distinctly human: for story, for music, for the imagining of other minds, for the construction of the shared worlds of meaning that are the foundation of everything that will eventually be called culture and civilization and history. Tonight, the rain falls on the hides above, and the fire burns below, and the group gathers in the warm circle of light, and the oldest human ritual begins again, as it has begun every night for as long as there have been nights and fires and human beings to sit between them. There is a moment, sometime in the middle of the evening, when the older woman begins to speak. She has been quiet for most of the meal, eating with the focused attention that hunger produces, watching the group with the particular quality of observation that very old people sometimes develop, a kind of seeing that is less about gathering new information and more about reading what is already known against what is currently happening, checking whether things are as they should be. Now the food is mostly finished. The fire has been fed. The rain on the hides above has settled into a steady rhythm that is almost musical, and she begins. What she says, you cannot hear in any language you understand. The words, if they are fully words in the way that modern words, are sounds that encode meanings through a system that shares some features with modern human language and lacks others in ways that linguists and cognitive scientists and evolutionary biologists have been debating for decades without resolution. What is not in doubt is that the people around this fire are communicating. Complex, specific, emotionally nuanced communication. The kind that requires something more than the warning calls and social signals of other primates. The kind that can carry information about things that are not present. Events that happened in the past, plans for the future, explanations of how things work, stories about people who are no longer alive. The question of when human language emerged in its fully modern form is one of the most difficult questions in all of science, because language leaves almost no direct trace in the archaeological record. You cannot dig up a conversation. You cannot date a sentence. What you can find are the indirect signatures of language-capable brains, the hyoid bone, the small horseshoe-shaped bone in the throat that supports the muscles used in speech, which in modern humans has a shape that allows the full range of vowel sounds, and that in earlier hominins was shaped differently. You can find the Broca's area impression inside fossilized skulls, the region of the brain most associated with the production of language. And note when it begins to appear in the archaeological record. You can find the evidence of symbolic thought, ochre pigment used for body decoration, geometric engravings on bone and stone, the deliberate burial of the dead with objects, and infer that the minds producing these things were capable of the kind of abstract reasoning that language both enables and requires. The people around this fire have all of these things. Their hyoid bones are shaped like yours. Their brains are the same size and the same structure as yours. They make art. There is a piece of ochre in the camp right now. A piece of red stone worn smooth by handling and marked with a series of parallel lines that mean something. Though what exactly they mean is not something you could easily explain to a stranger. They bury their dead, sometimes with flowers. Pollen has been found in burial sites of this period, pressed into the soil around the bones of the people who were placed there with intention and care. They are, in every neurological sense that matters, as capable of language as any modern human being. what their language sounds like, how complex its grammar is, how large its vocabulary is, whether it has tenses and conditionals, and the ability to discuss hypotheticals. These are questions that cannot be answered with certainty. What can be said is that the behavioral complexity of people like your group, the planning required for cooperative hunting, the ecological knowledge required for successful gathering, the social coordination required to maintain a group of 30 people in a landscape without permanent resources, almost certainly requires language of considerable sophistication. You cannot plan a cooperative hunt without the ability to discuss the plan. You cannot transmit detailed botanical knowledge without the ability to describe plants and their properties and the conditions under which they are safe. You cannot maintain the social relationships of a group without the ability to talk about the people in the group, their histories, their characters, their obligations to each other. The older woman is telling a story. You know this from the quality of the attention around the fire, the way people have stopped what they were doing to listen, the way the children have moved closer, the way the storyteller's voice changes register between the parts that are description and the parts that are voices, the different voices of the different characters in the story expressed through changes in pitch and rhythm, and the quality of the silence that follows each significant moment. You do not know this story. It is one of the older ones, one that predates the current membership of the group, and that the older woman is one of the last people who knows in its full form. It involves, as far as you can follow it, a time long ago when the group was in a different place, in a valley to the south that was warmer and richer than the current territory. And something happened there, something involving water, or the absence of water, or a change in the animals that were available that required the group to move. The story is not only about what happened, it is about how people behaved in the face of what happened. Which ones showed the qualities that the group values: steadiness, generosity, the willingness to carry more than your share, and which ones did not. It is a story about values, embedded in events, preserved in memory, transmitted by voice across a distance of time that cannot be measured. This is what oral literature is, not the simplified version that the word oral sometimes implies, not just stories for entertainment, not just myths and legends with symbolic meanings that can be unpacked by scholars, but the full complexity of what a society without writing uses story for, which is everything that writing is eventually used for: the preservation of historical events, the transmission of ecological knowledge, the articulation of values, the maintenance of social identity, the recording of what has been tried and what has worked and what has failed. The older woman is not just telling a story, she is maintaining the archive, research on oral traditions in cultures that have been studied before the dominance of literacy, suggests that oral memory is more reliable and more capacious than literate people typically assume. the Australian Aboriginal peoples maintained accurate geographical and astronomical knowledge across thousands of generations in oral tradition. Knowledge that has been verified against geological and astronomical records and found to be precise. The Homeric epics, before they were written down, were preserved in oral tradition for centuries with a fidelity and complexity that modern scholars continue to find remarkable. The mechanisms for this preservation, the use of rhythm and repetition and formulaic phrases that aid memory, the social function of stories that makes their accurate transmission a matter of communal importance, the existence of specialist rememberers whose identity and status depend on their accuracy, are sophisticated and reliable in ways that literate cultures systematically underestimate. The children listen to the older woman's story with an attention that is not the passive reception of entertainment, but the active work of memorization. They are, in watching her, learning the story themselves, absorbing it through repetition and attention over many tellings into the deep memory where things that will be needed are kept. One of them, the older girl who has been gathering alongside the adults for 2 seasons now, is at the age where she is beginning to be trusted with portions of the archive that the group considers important enough to be distributed across multiple memories, kept in more than one mind against the possibility that any individual mind might be lost. In a world without writing, the death of an old person is the burning of a library. The group works against this by distributing knowledge, by ensuring that the most important things are held by more than one person, by the continuous transmission that happens around fires like this one every night. The language that carries all of this is not a primitive thing. It is not a simplified version of modern language, a rough draft of what language will eventually become. It is a full human language, complete and sufficient to its purposes, capable of the full range of things that human minds need language for. What it lacks, compared to a modern language, is not expressiveness or complexity, but vocabulary. The words for things that do not yet exist. The things that will be invented and discovered and built in the 50,000 years that separate this fire from the world you actually live in. There are no words for writing, or agriculture, or cities, or money, or nations, or any of the 1,000 other features of the world that will eventually require words. But there is a word for the specific quality of silence that means danger, and a word for the feeling of returning to a place that used to have water and finding it dry, and a word for the particular orange of the sky before a storm, and a word for the thing that happens sometimes between people who have been through something difficult together. The wordless understanding that does not need to be spoken because it is already shared. The older woman finishes her story. There is a moment of quiet that is not uncomfortable, but full. The quality of silence that follows something that has been well said and well heard. Then, Someone asks a question, or makes a comment, or begins another story, and the fire burns lower, and the rain continues, and the night goes on. The flint is not a rock, not to the man who is working it. To an untrained eye, it is indistinguishable from any other stone on the ground, grey, dense, unremarkable. But to the man with the damaged hand, sitting cross-legged near the fire, with a piece of antler in his lap, and a nodule of flint the size of a fist in his left hand, it is something more like a conversation. He has been looking at it for perhaps 10 minutes before striking it once, turning it in the firelight, reading the grain of the stone the way a carpenter reads the grain of wood, looking for the internal structure, the direction of the fracture planes, the flaws and inclusions that will determine what the stone will and will not do when struck. Flint is a form of silica, microcrystalline quartz, and it fractures in a way that almost no other common material does, in smooth, controlled curves that can be predicted and directed by someone who understands the mechanics. When struck correctly, it produces a flake whose edge is sharper than a surgical scalpel. The cutting edges of flint tools, measured under electron microscopes, are thinner than a single cell. No metal that will be available to human beings for the next 45,000 years will match this sharpness. The obsidian scalpels used in modern eye surgery are the closest equivalent, and they are made from essentially the same material by essentially the same physics. The man with the damaged hand knows none of this in those terms. What he knows is the stone itself, how to read it, how to strike it, how to remove a flake of exactly the thickness and shape he wants by controlling the angle and force of the blow and the precise point at which the antler contacts the surface. He learned this from watching, and then from doing, and then from years of doing, until the knowledge moved out of the conscious mind and into the hands, into the fingers that feel the vibration of the stone when it is struck, and know from that vibration whether the flake has come away cleanly, or has crushed, or has run in an unexpected direction. The tool he is making tonight is a small point, a projectile tip for one of the spears that was damaged in the hunt this morning. The point driven too deep into the animal's rib and twisted when it was extracted. He works steadily, removing small flakes from both faces of the piece in a pattern that thins the stone while maintaining its structural integrity, shaping it toward the narrow, symmetrical form that will seat cleanly in the split end of the shaft and hold there when bound with sinew and sealed with pine pitch. The work takes perhaps an hour. The finished point, when he holds it up in the firelight and looks along its edges, is nearly perfect. Not because perfection is an abstract ideal he is pursuing, but because imperfection means failure at a critical moment, and failure at a critical moment in a hunt has consequences that go beyond the lost tool. Around him, others are working too. This is what evenings are for. The maintenance and production of the objects that daily life requires. the continuous low-level manufacturing that keeps the group equipped for the demands of the next day and the day after. A woman is softening a piece of hide by working it repeatedly over a rounded stone, pulling and folding and working the leather until the stiffness leaves it and it becomes the supple material that can be cut and sewn into clothing. The softening of hide is slow work. A large skin might require hours of this treatment, and it is the kind of work that can be done while talking or listening to stories, the hands occupied with something familiar while the mind is elsewhere. Another person is making cordage. Cordage, string, rope, binding is among the most important technologies in the human repertoire, and it is almost completely invisible in the archaeological record because organic materials rarely survive. But without cordage, hafted tools are impossible. You cannot bind a stone point to a wooden shaft without something to bind it with. Nets and bags and carrying devices are impossible. The bow, when it eventually appears, is impossible. The entire category of composite tools, tools made from more than one material joined together, depends on the ability to make reliable binding. The person making cordage tonight is twisting plant fibers together with a particular two-handed rolling motion that produces a twisted cord stronger than either strand alone. A technique so ancient and so universal that versions of it appear in virtually every culture ever studied. What strikes a modern observer about all of this work? If a modern observer could somehow be present, watching by firelight is how good it is. Not good in a primitive or approximating way, but genuinely, technically good, the product of deep expertise applied with precision and care. There is a tendency to imagine prehistoric tools as crude, rough, barely functional. The cartoonish club and the chipped rock. The actual objects that survive from this period tell a different story. The best Upper Paleolithic tools are things of real beauty, symmetrical, carefully finished, proportioned, with an aesthetic sensibility that goes beyond pure function. Researchers have found points that are too thin and delicate to have been functional tools, objects that were never used, made with a care and a precision that suggests they were made for other reasons, for display, for gift, for the satisfaction of making something well, for whatever the Upper Paleolithic equivalent of art was. The group you are part of carries, at any given time, perhaps 100 distinct objects, tools and containers and clothing and fire-making equipment and the raw materials for making more. Each of these objects represents hours of skilled labor, and each of them is maintained and repaired rather than discarded, because the resources required to make them are not always immediately available, and the time required to make them is always in competition with other demands. The stone tools can be resharpened as they dull, the edge restored by removing small flakes from the working edge until the tool is too small to be useful, at which point the remaining material may be reworked into a different, smaller tool. Nothing is wasted. The concept of disposability does not exist. The man with the damaged hand finishes his point, tests its edge against the back of his thumbnail, and sets it aside to cool before he attaches it to the shaft. He picks up the next piece of flint from the small pile beside him and turns it in the firelight, reading it, beginning the conversation again. The distribution of the meat happens before the cooking, and the distribution is not random. This is one of the things about hunter-gatherer societies that most consistently surprises people who encounter the research for the first time. The degree to which the sharing of food is governed by rules, explicit and implicit, that are understood and enforced by the entire group. The popular image of prehistoric life as a world of every person for themselves, the strong taking from the weak, the successful hunter keeping the fruits of his success. This image is almost entirely wrong. The ethnographic record of hunter-gatherer societies studied in the 20th century, from the Hadza of Tanzania to the Kung of the Kalahari to the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, shows something close to the opposite. Large game, when it is brought back to camp, is divided according to rules that ensure every member of the group receives a share, regardless of who made the kill. The hunter does not own the animal he kills. This is a principle so fundamental to the social organization of your group that it barely requires stating. It is simply how things are, as obvious and as unquestioned as the fact that the sky is above and the ground is below. The animal belongs to the group. The person who killed it has obligations, not privileges. He will distribute the meat according to the rules that govern distribution, and those rules will ensure that the oldest and the youngest and the sick and the unlucky receive their portion alongside the skilled and the strong. In some hunter-gatherer societies studied by anthropologists, the person who makes the kill actually receives a smaller share than others, as a check against the accumulation of status that successful hunting might otherwise produce. The logic of this system is not difficult to understand from the outside. In a world without refrigeration, large game cannot be stored. A 300-kilogram aurochs represents far more meat than 5 hunters can eat before it spoils, and the alternative to sharing is waste. More importantly, hunting is unreliable. The group that shares when one hunter is successful will be fed by the others when that hunter fails, which he will. The sharing is not altruism in the modern sense. It is reciprocal insurance, the most rational possible response to a world where individual success is never guaranteed, and collective survival depends on collective support. Tonight the fire has been built up for cooking, larger and hotter than the maintenance fire of the night hours, the hardwood coals producing the steady, intense heat that is best for the large pieces of meat that will be set on flat stones near the coals or suspended above them on green sticks. The smell changes as the meat heats, First, the raw smell of blood and muscle. Then, the complex transformation that heat produces in protein, the browning and the deepening of flavor that cooking creates, and that the human palate, shaped over hundreds of thousands of years of cooked food, is exquisitely calibrated to find appealing. There is fat. The marrow bones from the hunt have been cracked on flat stones, and the rich yellow marrow scooped out and added to the cooking. Marrow is among the most calorie-dense foods available in this landscape, a concentrated source of fat and fat-soluble vitamins that the body craves with a specificity that is entirely biological. The brain, that expensive organ, runs on fat as much as it runs on glucose, and the particular hunger for fatty marrow and organ meat that hunter-gatherers consistently display is not a cultural preference, but a physiological signal. The body knowing what it needs and communicating that need in the most direct way available to it. The meal that results from all of this is not sophisticated in the culinary sense. There are no spices beyond whatever herbs and seeds were gathered today, no preparation beyond the cooking itself. But it is good, genuinely, deeply satisfying, in a way that has less to do with flavor than with the particular satisfaction of hunger that was real, being met by food that was earned. You have walked many kilometers today, thrown a spear, processed an animal, carried a heavy load back to camp. Your body has used a great deal of energy, and the food you are eating is replacing that energy in the most direct and immediate way possible. The satisfaction of this is physical and complete in a way that the satisfaction of a modern meal, eaten not from real hunger, but from habit or appetite or social obligation, rarely matches. The children eat with the focused intensity of small animals, quickly and completely, the youngest reaching for more before the first portion is finished, the older ones already slowing as the hunger gives way to fullness. The adults eat more deliberately, the pace of the meal settling into something closer to the communal rhythm of people who have time now, who are not going anywhere until morning, who can allow the evening to extend itself around the food and the fire. The conversation around the food is different from the conversation around the fire later. It is more practical, more immediate. What happened today? What was seen and done? The small incidents of the hunt and the gathering that have not yet been shared with the whole group. The woman who found the hazel grove reports on its condition, how many nuts it held, how close they are to full ripeness, the calculation of whether to return in 2 days or 4. The man with the damaged hand describes a place he passed near the northern waterhole where the ground was disturbed in a way that suggested a large predator had been there recently. Not today, the signs were old, but recently enough to note and remember. This information is received and stored by everyone present, added to the running map of the landscape that every adult member of the group maintains in memory. The constantly updated picture of where things are and what is happening in the territory. This sharing of information is not incidental to the meal. It is part of what the meal is for. The anthropologist Kim Sterelny has argued that the cognitive demands of hunter-gatherer life, the need to maintain accurate, detailed, constantly updated models of a complex landscape and its resources, are among the primary drivers of human intelligence, and that these demands are social as well as individual. No single person can observe everything. No single person can be everywhere at once. The group that pools its observations, that shares what each member has seen and inferred, that maintains a collective model of the territory that is more accurate and more complete than any individual model could be. That group is smarter than the sum of its members. The meal is, among other things, the daily meeting at which the collective intelligence of the group is updated and maintained. The bones that remain after the meal are not discarded carelessly. The larger ones will be worked tomorrow, split for marrow if they have not already been, or used as raw material for tools, or fed to the fire as fuel if nothing else. The scraps of meat and fat that cannot be eaten tonight will be set aside to be eaten tomorrow, or dried if the weather permits. The thin strips of meat laid out on a flat stone near the fire, where the heat and the smoke will begin the preservation process that allows meat to last for days rather than hours. Nothing is wasted. This principle operates not as a conscious ethical commitment, but as a practical reflex. The body and mind of someone who has never known surplus, responding automatically to the presence of resources by conserving them against future need. The fire settles into its evening configuration, fed, steady. The immediate demands of cooking done, and the longer business of warmth and light taking over. The group settles with it, the meal finished, the day's work reviewed, the evening opening out into the slower time that comes after necessity has been met and before sleep takes over. Someone begins to hum. Not a recognizable tune, nothing that would survive the night, but a sound that is musical in intention and that produces a small shift in the atmosphere of the camp, a softening, an easing of the collective alertness that has been present since dawn. The older woman looks into the fire with the expression of someone who is thinking about something that is not in the room. There is a cave 2 days' walk from this camp that your people visit perhaps once a year, sometimes less. It is not a place where anyone sleeps or stores food or takes shelter from the weather. It is not practical in any of the ways that caves are sometimes practical. It is visited for a different reason, one that is difficult to explain in the vocabulary of need and resource and survival that governs most of daily life. The cave has paintings in it, animals mostly, aurochs and horses, and something that might be a mammoth rendered on the curved walls in red and black and yellow-brown, the figures sometimes overlapping, sometimes placed in relation to each other in ways that suggest not randomness but intention, though what the intention is cannot be read from the outside. Some of the paintings are very old, older than the oldest person in your group, older than their parents and grandparents, old enough that the people who made them are connected to the current group only through the unbroken chain of people who have visited the cave and added to it, and looked at what was there before them, and understood something about what it meant. Some of the paintings were made by people your grandmother's grandmother knew. Some were made by people so far back that they exist only as story, the distant ancestors who did certain things and who are present now only in the things they left behind. Tonight, no one is going to the cave, but the cave is present in the conversation, the way certain places are always present in the thinking of people who are embedded in a landscape, not thought about explicitly, but forming part of the background against which current events are understood. What is being made tonight around this fire is smaller and more immediate. The man who came back from the hunt with a large intact bone from the aurochs' leg has been working on it since the meal, not napping it or splitting it for marrow, but carving it, using a sharp flint burin to incise a series of marks into the surface. The marks are not random. They form a pattern, parallel lines, some curved, organized in a way that is clearly deliberate and that means something to the person making them, even if what it means cannot be read by a modern observer who stumbles across this bone in an excavated site 50,000 years from now. The archaeologist Francesco De Rico has spent decades studying objects like this one, and what his research suggests is that many of the geometric marks on bone and stone from the Upper Paleolithic are not decorative in the modern sense, not made for aesthetic pleasure alone, but functional, recording something. Some of them may be lunar calendars, tracking the phases of the moon across months, keeping count of days in a system that is more structured than it first appears. Some may record kills, or migrations, or the cycles of female fertility that are relevant to a group whose survival depends on knowing when to expect births and deaths. The exact meanings are lost, but the act of recording, the impulse to make a mark that stands for something outside itself, to externalize memory in a form that persists beyond the moment of its creation. This impulse is one of the most important things that human beings do, and it is happening right here, right now, around this fire, in the scratching of a flint on bone. The children who have been awake through the early part of the evening are mostly asleep now, the younger ones curled against the adults who are still sitting by the fire. The warmth and the rhythm of breathing, and the low sounds of the camp, having done what warmth and rhythm and human presence have always done for children. The older ones are still awake, but quiet, listening rather than participating, at the age where the adult world is becoming interesting in a new way, not just as a source of instruction and example, but as something to observe and assess. a world they will shortly be required to enter fully. The talk around the fire has shifted from the practical to the other kind. In the practical talk, the subjects are immediate and specific. What happened, what was seen, what needs to be done. In the other kind of talk, the subjects are different. They are the questions that do not have practical answers. What happens to a person after they die? Where the animals come from and where they go? Why the seasons change? Why some people get sick and others do not? Why the hunt succeeds on some days and fails on others when the conditions seem the same? Why dreams sometimes show things that later happen? The boundary between what can be known through observation and what cannot be known that way. The boundary that a modern person would roughly describe as the boundary between science and religion is not drawn in the same place in your world as it is in the modern one. It is drawn differently, or perhaps not drawn at all, the two categories blending into each other in ways that are not confused but simply reflect a different understanding of what kinds of things the world contains. There are spirits. This is not a belief that requires defending or justifying. It is simply a description of what the world is like, the same way that the world contains aurochs and flint and water and fire and people. The spirits are not separate from the natural world, but part of it, present in the animals and the landscape features and the weather and the particular quality of certain places. The cave with the paintings, a spring that has never gone dry within living memory, a stand of trees where the lightning struck twice and the bark is still blackened. The relationship between people and spirits is managed through attention and respect, and the observance of certain behaviors that maintain the balance that allows things to go well. When things go wrong, when the hunt fails, when someone falls ill, when the group's luck turns, the question of what has disturbed the balance and how to restore it is a serious one that the group takes seriously. The person in your group who manages this relationship most directly is a woman perhaps 25 years old who has shown since childhood a particular sensitivity to the non-practical dimensions of experience, who has dreams that sometimes prove accurate, who can enter states of altered consciousness through certain practices that she has developed and refined, and who serves as the intermediary between the group and whatever is present beyond what can be directly observed. She is not a priest in the sense that later religions will produce priests. She has no institutional authority, no formal training, no doctrine to enforce. She is something more like a specialist in attention, someone whose particular gift is for the kinds of perception that are not available to ordinary waking consciousness. Tonight she is not performing any specific practice. She is sitting by the fire like everyone else, listening and occasionally contributing to the conversation. But her presence has a quality that the others are aware of, a kind of additional attentiveness that is always there, and when she speaks it is listened to with a slightly different quality of attention than when others speak. She says something, and the group goes quiet in a way that is different from the ordinary quiet of listening. She is describing something she saw in a dream last night, not reporting it as a curiosity, but as information relevant to decisions the group will need to make. The dream involved water, a specific place to the east where water was present in the dream in a way it was not present the last time anyone was there. It may mean nothing. It may mean that the seasonal water has returned there, which would be relevant to the question of where to move next as the weather changes. It will be filed alongside the other information the group holds about that location, neither dismissed nor acted on immediately, held as one input among many in the continuous calculation of where to go and when. The fire is low now. The bone carver has set his work aside and is looking into the coals with the particular blankness of a mind that has finished one thing and not yet started another. The rain has stopped. Through the smoke hole in the hide above, a few stars are visible, the clouds having broken apart to reveal the sky in patches. One of the men begins to sing. It is not a performance. There is no audience, no distinction between singer and listeners, just a sound that begins and that others gradually join, a rhythm that emerges from the joining, and that seems, once it is established, to have always been there. The song has words or sounds that function like words, though their meaning is not always clear even to the people singing them. They are old sounds, older than anyone's memory of their origin, transmitted because they have always been transmitted, because the singing of them is what this time of evening and this quality of firelight and this particular mood calls for. Outside the circle of firelight, the night is enormous and dark and full of things that have no names yet. The fire is down to coals, not out. The man who tends it would not allow it to go out, and even in sleep some part of him monitors the quality of the warmth in the air and will wake him if it drops below a certain threshold. But it is low, banked for the night, the coals covered with ash to slow the burn, the small orange glow visible under the grey surface, like something alive and patient waiting for morning. The group is settling, not all at once. There is no signal, no designated hour, no moment when the evening officially ends and the night begins. It happens gradually, the way the evening itself happened gradually. One person drifting into silence, and then into stillness, and then into the particular quality of breathing that means sleep, and then another, until the sounds of the camp shift from the sounds of people awake to the sounds of people sleeping. A different register entirely, slower and deeper, and without the sharp edges of intention. You have been awake for perhaps 16 hours. In a world without artificial light, the day begins with the light and ends not long after the dark, not immediately after. The fire and the social pull of the group keeping people awake into the early part of the night, but not dramatically later. The sleep that comes now is not the sleep of someone who has been fighting it for hours, the accumulated debt of a body pushed past its natural stopping point. It is sleep that arrives when the body is ready for it, which is a different quality of sleep than most modern people experience. The research on sleep in populations that live without artificial light, conducted by the anthropologist Jerome Siegel, who attached sleep monitors to members of traditional communities in Tanzania and Bolivia and Namibia who had no access to electricity, produced results that surprised researchers who had assumed that pre-industrial sleep was simply longer, more natural versions of modern sleep. What Siegel found was more complex. These communities did not sleep significantly more than modern industrial populations, roughly 6.5 to 7 hours on average, similar to or slightly less than what studies of modern populations typically show. But the quality and timing were different. They fell asleep on average 2 to 3 hours after sunset, not immediately after. They woke without alarm at approximately the same time each morning, and crucially, they showed almost no signs of insomnia. The middle of the night wakefulness that is one of the most common complaints of the modern world was essentially absent. The reason for this, Siegel argues, is temperature. The communities he studied fell asleep as the temperature dropped in the late evening and woke as it began to rise before dawn. Their sleep timed not by clocks or by fatigue management, but by the ancient biological rhythm that evolved in response to the temperature cycle of the natural day. The body temperature drops during sleep and rises in the hours before waking. And this internal rhythm is most easily entrained by the external temperature signal of the natural world, a signal that artificial heating and cooling and lighting have largely removed from modern life, with consequences for sleep quality that may be significant. Your sleep tonight will be of the kind that Siegel's research describes. You will sleep deeply and continuously until the cold before dawn, the particular cold of the last hour of night, when the temperature reaches its lowest point and the body's own temperature regulation begins to work against the continuation of sleep. You may have a period of lighter sleep in the middle of the night, not wakefulness exactly, but a shallowing, during which you are aware of the sounds of the camp and the quality of the air without being fully awake. This is normal. The historian Roger Eckertz, who has studied pre-industrial sleep patterns through historical records, found extensive evidence that two-phase sleep, a first sleep followed by a period of quiet wakefulness and then a second sleep, was the norm in European populations before the industrial era, and may be the natural human pattern that artificial light has suppressed rather than a disorder to be corrected. You sleep close to others. The group does not separate into individual shelters for the night. There are not enough hides for full individual enclosures. and the warmth of shared bodies is a resource as real as the warmth of the fire. 2, 3, 4 people in a sleeping group, arranged with the practical geometry of people who have been doing this their whole lives. The smaller bodies in the middle where they are warmest, the larger ones on the outside where they are slightly less warm, but where they form a barrier against the cold and against anything that might approach in the night. This is not a conscious arrangement. No one decided it. No one enforces it. It is simply what happens, night after night, the group assembling itself for sleep, the way it assembles itself for everything, through habit and mutual adjustment and the accumulated wisdom of long practice. The sounds of the night outside the shelter are different from the sounds of the day. The daytime sounds are mostly birds and wind, and the occasional distant animal call, sounds that belong to a landscape in motion. The nighttime sounds are lower and less frequent, punctuated by silences that have a different quality than daytime silence, heavier, more weighted, carrying a different kind of attention in them. An owl calls from somewhere to the north, the same call repeated at intervals that are almost but not quite regular. Something moves in the brush at the edge of camp, small judging by the sound, a rodent or a small bird disturbed from its roost. The fire shifts, a coal settling deeper into the ash with a soft sound that is one of the most familiar sounds in the world. You dream. The content of the dreams of a person living 50,000 years ago is not something that can be recovered from any archaeological record. But there is no reason to think the basic mechanics of dreaming are different from modern dreaming. The same REM sleep, the same activation of the visual cortex, the same consolidation of the day's experiences into long-term memory, the same strange and sometimes luminous quality of the dreaming mind, freed from the constraints of waking perception. The dreams involve, probably, the same things that dominate waking life: the hunt, the landscape, the people of the group, the events of the day just ended. They may involve things that did not happen, impossible combinations of familiar elements, the kind of dream logic that modern people recognize immediately as dream logic, and that in your world may be experienced as something else, as communication, as vision, as the night world equivalent of the spirit knowledge that the young woman manages in waking life. The older woman does not dream easily. She lies in the dark for a time after the others are asleep, the way she often does. Not with the anxious wakefulness of someone fighting sleep, but with the calm alertness of someone who does not need to sleep immediately and is content to wait for it. She listens to the camp settling and the fire breathing and the night outside doing what the night does. She thinks about the water the young woman described in her dream, the water to the east. She thinks about the hazelnuts and how many days remain before they should be harvested fully, and whether the group will still be in this area, or whether the signs suggest moving sooner. She thinks about a child in the group who has been eating less than usual for 3 days. the slight change in coloring that she has noticed and that no one else seems to have noticed yet, and what it might mean. Then, sometime in the hour before midnight, she sleeps. The camp is quiet. The coals breathe under their ash. The stars wheel overhead in patterns that will not have names for another 40,000 years, and the people beneath them sleep in the oldest way, close together and warm, the darkness held back by the last light of the fire. You wake before dawn. The cold is the same cold it was yesterday morning, and the morning before that, and every morning of your life going back to the first mornings you can remember, when you were small enough to be carried and the cold was someone else's problem to manage. It is not a surprise. Nothing about this morning is a surprise. The grey light at the edge of the sky, the birds beginning their first tentative calls, the smell of the banked fire and the damp earth, and the particular combination of smells that is, in your experience, simply the smell of morning. All of it is familiar in the deepest possible sense. The familiarity not of something encountered often, but of something that has never been absent. You have lived one day, one ordinary day, unremarkable by the standards of your world, neither the best day nor the worst. The hunt succeeded, which is not always the case. The gathering was productive, which is not always the case. No one was injured or sick or lost. The rain held off until evening. By the measures available to you, it was a good day. Not extraordinary, just good. Now consider what that day required of you. You woke into a landscape of genuine danger and navigated it successfully for 16 hours, using knowledge so deep and so specific that a modern expert in the relevant fields, ecology, botany, animal behavior, flint knapping, fire management, human psychology, would need decades of specialized study to approximate even a portion of it. You read the landscape the way a scholar reads a text, in a language that took a lifetime to learn, and that is not written anywhere, and cannot be recovered if it is lost. You cooperated with other people, in a hunt that required spatial coordination, shared attention, and the suppression of individual impulse in favor of collective timing. Cooperation of a kind that modern studies of human cognition identify as one of our most distinctively and elaborately developed capacities. You shared what you had according to rules that served the long-term survival of the group at the cost of short-term individual advantage, which is to say you behaved in the way that evolutionary theory predicts will be selected for in environments where individual survival depends on group cohesion. And then you sat around a fire and told stories. The question that this kind of history always eventually asks, the question that is worth sitting with for a moment before sleep takes you, is what the relationship is between that person and the person you are now. The easy answer is that they are entirely different, separated by 50,000 years of accumulated change. by language and agriculture and cities and science and technology and all the rest of it, by a distance so vast that the comparison is almost meaningless. The easy answer is wrong, or at least incomplete. The brain you are using right now to process these words is the same brain, not similar, the same, in all the ways that matter neurologically. The same capacity for language, for abstract thought, for planning and memory and the modeling of other minds. The same emotional architecture, the same social needs, the same deep requirements for connection and meaning and the particular satisfaction of work done well. The same tendency to find faces in random patterns, to feel the cold, to want to be near fire, to feel safer in a group than alone, to be moved by music, to need stories. The cognitive scientist Daniel Kahneman, describing the two systems of human thinking, the fast, intuitive system and the slow, deliberate system, was describing a brain that evolved not in offices and classrooms, but in exactly the landscape you have just spent a day moving through. The fast system, the one that processes the call of a bird and translates it immediately into information about the state of the environment, was shaped by mornings exactly like this one. The social emotions, the loyalty and the shame, and the pride and the gratitude, and the specific discomfort of being excluded from a group were shaped by exactly this kind of group, exactly this kind of interdependence. What has changed is almost everything outside the skull. The world has been rebuilt several times over by the accumulated work of all the generations between that fire and this one. Agriculture, cities, writing, science, technology. Each of these transformations changed the conditions of human life profoundly and changed what the same brain was required to do. But the brain itself, shaped over millions of years of evolution, and then essentially fixed in its current form by the time of the people you have spent today among, has not kept pace with the speed of cultural change. It is, in a phrase that the evolutionary biologists use, a Paleolithic brain in a modern world. A brain built for the savannah, running the software of industrial civilization. This mismatch explains some things. It may explain why loneliness, the absence of the deep, continuous, embodied social contact that your day was built around, is experienced as physical pain. Because the brain processes social exclusion through the same pathways as physical pain. Because in the world the brain was built for, social exclusion was physical danger. It may explain why the modern epidemic of anxiety and depression falls disproportionately on people whose lives are most disconnected from the things the brain was built to do. Purposeful physical activity, direct contact with the natural world, deep social bonds maintained through shared work, the satisfaction of competence in skills that have immediate and visible results. It may explain why, 50,000 years after the last person sat in a cave and painted an animal on the wall by firelight, human beings are still telling stories in the dark, still gathering around the metaphorical fire, still seeking, in the quiet hours before sleep, the sound of a voice describing a world that is not quite this one, taking them somewhere their body cannot go, giving shape and meaning to the shapeless hours. The person who woke this morning in the cold, in the dark, listening to the birds, they are not so far away. They are present in the way your body responds to warmth, in the particular quality of attention you give to unfamiliar sounds at night, in the social hunger that no amount of digital connection quite satisfies, in the way stories reach you even now, even here, even after everything that has changed. You are that person, not metaphorically, biologically, neurologically, in every way that the structure of the body can be said to determine the structure of experience. The world around you has changed beyond anything they could have imagined. The world inside you is recognizably the same. Close your eyes now, if they are not already closed. Let the sounds of the world grow quiet around you. Somewhere, 50,000 years ago, a fire is burning low in the cold before dawn. The camp is sleeping. The birds are beginning. The day is about to start. Exactly the same day it has always been. The oldest day there is. Good night. Sleep well.